All right, today we're going to dive into one of the most surprisingly fierce debates in the entire programming world, punctuation. Yeah, you heard me. We're talking about the humble comma and the, let's be honest, often controversial semicolon. These tiny little marks on your screen, they're the source of compiler errors, massive style guide wars, and some genuinely clever language design.
So it all kicks off with this simple, almost ridiculous question. Imagine you're writing a list. You've added the very last item, and the language forces you to stick a comma after it. It just feels wrong, you know? It looks totally redundant, but if you don't do it, boom, your code breaks. Why on earth would a rule like this even exist?
And look, this isn't some hypothetical. This is real code from the Go programming language. Over on the left, you've got what looks like a perfectly normal list of items. But that code, it's going to fail to compile. Now on the right, it's the exact same code, but with one tiny change. A comma after that last number, 42. And this version works perfectly. So what is going on here?
When that code on the left fails, the Go compiler spits out this super cryptic error message. It doesn't say, hey, you forgot a trailing comma. Nope. It says, missing comma before new line. And that message, well, that's our big clue. It points directly to the secret reason behind this whole bizarre rule.
So why does Go, a language that's famous for being simple and straightforward, enforce this strange little comma rule? Well, it turns out the answer has way less to do with us programmers and everything to do with the compiler.
It all comes down to something called automatic semicolon insertion. See, to make its own job easier, the Go compiler's first pass, the lexer, just scans the code and automatically jams the semicolon at the end of most lines. So when it sees the number 42, then a new line, then a closing brace, it helpfully shoves a semicolon right after the 42. But 42 semicolon inside a list? That's a syntax error. By adding that trailing comma yourself, you're basically telling the lexer, hey buddy, back off. This list isn't done yet. Don't you dare put a semicolon here. It's a simple rule that makes the computer's job a whole lot simpler, even if it feels kind of weird to us humans.
Okay, so Go's mandatory comma is definitely an outlier, a really unique case. But it cracks open a much bigger question. How do other programming languages handle all these little details? Let's zoom out and try to map the entire landscape of punctuation philosophy.
And that brings us to the two main battlegrounds. We can organize pretty much every major language on this simple grid. On one axis, we've got the rule for trailing commas in a list. Are they required, optional, or totally forbidden? And on the other axis, the rule for semicolons at the end of a statement, required or optional. So we can immediately place our first case study, Go, and it lands in this very, very lonely box, required trailing commas, at least in multi-line lists, and optional semicolons, since the compiler adds them for you. It's really the only mainstream language that lives here, which is exactly what makes it so surprising when you first run into it.
Now, let's explore the most crowded, and frankly, the most contentious part of our map. This is the quadrant where both trailing commas and semicolons are optional. And oh boy, this is where developer opinions run wild.
The absolute poster child for this quadrant is JavaScript. The language itself doesn't technically require semicolons because it has its own automatic insertion rules, but the community is deeply, deeply divided. You've got popular style guides on completely opposite sides of the fence. Standard.js says to get rid of them. The massively influential Airbnb style guide says you must always use them. It is the modern-day tabs versus spaces, a holy war fought in every single code review.
And other languages in this optional camp have their own little cultures too. In Python, you can use a semicolon to put multiple statements on one line, but it's really frowned upon. Same thing in Ruby. Using semicolons is kind of a cultural tell, a dead giveaway that you probably just came from a language like Java or C++. The syntax allows it, but the community will definitely give you the side eye.
So we've seen the lone wolf, Go, and we've seen the chaotic democracy of the optional languages. But what about the other side of the map? Let's take a look at the languages that are much, much stricter about their rules.
First up is Rust, which has this fascinatingly elegant take. In Rust, the semicolon isn't just punctuation, it's semantic. It actually has meaning. If you put a semicolon at the end of a line, you're creating a statement. But if you leave out the semicolon on the very last line of a function, that line becomes the function's return value. The presence or absence of that one little character fundamentally changes what your code is doing. It's so cool.
And then you have Erlang, which might just be the strictest of them all. It doesn't just have one terminator, it has three. You use commas to separate function arguments, semicolons to separate different clauses, and a period, a full stop, to end a function definition entirely.
And for all three, a trailing one is strictly forbidden. There is one right way, and that's it. People often say it feels less like writing code and more like transcribing sheet music. Every single note and rest has to be absolutely perfect.
Haskell is another language that's firmly in that forbidden camp. A trailing comma is a hard error, period. And this has led to some pretty interesting community workarounds, like the comma leading style, where you actually put the comma at the beginning of each new line. It looks a little weird at first, I'll admit, but it makes adding or removing items from a list so much cleaner when you're looking at diffs in version control.
Now, after all this talk of required, optional, forbidden, semantic punctuation, I want you to just clear your mind for a second, because there's another approach entirely in the land of Lisp. This entire argument just vanishes. It's totally irrelevant. In Lisp and its dialects, everything is something called an S expression, which is basically a list surrounded by parentheses. There are no commas to separate items and no semicolons to end statements. The whole punctuation war that we've been exploring, it just does not exist there. There's a certain zen to that, right?
But hold on, there is a modern twist to this whole story. Because for a lot of developers today, these debates are becoming kind of academic. The arguments aren't being settled by humans and style guards anymore, but by the very tools we use to write our code. This quote from the source material just nails it. A developer was getting super frustrated because they thought YAML, which is a configuration language, was forcing them to add trailing commas. But it wasn't YAML at all. It was their code editor, which was configured for TypeScript, automatically adding the comma every single time they saved the file.
And here's what's going on. In languages where trailing commas are optional, like JavaScript and TypeScript, automatic formatters like Prettier are usually set up to add them by default, just for consistency. So every time you hit save, poof, the comma appears. After a while, your brain stops seeing it as a style choice, and it just starts to encode it as a mandatory rule, because you literally never see the code without it.
What this all means is that for a huge number of programmers, the great semicolon debate or the trailing comma question has already been answered for them. The tool made the decision for their team, and it enforces that decision relentlessly. The tooling won the argument, often before you even knew there was an argument to be had.
And this brings us right back to where we started. Remember Go's mandatory comma? That rule exists just to make the language parser's job easier. Well, the irony now is that our code editors are so intelligent they contain their own parsers. So the parser isn't just reading our code anymore. It's actively writing it and rewriting it for us on every single save.
This is the new reality. We basically have a little machine, a parser in our editor that writes the code, parses the code, and pretty much argues with itself about whether a trailing comma is needed. It resolves all these tiny syntax issues instantly and just moves on without us ever having to think about it.
And so we end on this thought. These punctuation rules were created for machines. Now machines are enforcing them for us. As our tools get smarter and take over more and more of this syntactic burden, it frees us up to focus on the big stuff, like logic and architecture. But it also makes you wonder, when the machine handles all the tiny details, what's the next great tabs versus spaces going to be? What's left for us to argue about?